Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, PFAS in Food Packaging, What You Should Know and What You Can Do. My name is Dr. Jill Oxley. I'm a breast cancer surgeon at Cape Cod Hospital and a member of the board of the Massachusetts Breast Cancer Coalition. I'm pleased to introduce our panelists, Dr. Arlene Blum, Executive Director of the Green Science Policy Institute, Dr. Laurel Schaider, Research Scientist at Silent Spring Institute, and Dr. Maricel Maffini, an environmental health sciences and independent consultant. We have quite a bit to cover, so I'll turn it over to Dr. Blum to begin.
Well, thank you very much. I'd like to thank all of you for your very good work and the Massachusetts Breast Cancer Coalition for really decades of work on breast cancer and for organizing this meeting. So today we're going to be talking, as you said, about PFAS in food packaging, what you should know and what you can do. And just to say, the Green Science Policy Institute are scientists who write papers, and the papers are selected to have an impact on public health. We bring together decision makers from scientists, government decision makers, people from business and industry and NGOs to learn about these things, and then we communicate them broadly. And we have found that this works really well to help change government policy and also purchasing of manufacturers and retailers. And we'll be talking about how this has all been working with food packaging. So you've probably all heard there are tens of thousands of chemicals out there, that it takes years of research and then advocacy to phase out even one, and then often the substitute is a similar chemical with similar structure, function, and toxicity. And when you look at all this, it seems bewildering. But at our institute, at one of our retreats, we came up with the idea that you could pick out families or classes of chemicals that had similar structure, function, and in this case, toxicity, and came up with 6 classes or families that contain most of the chemicals of concern in everyday products. And I'll encourage you to take a few minutes and go to 6classes.org, where we have 4-minute videos on each of these 6 classes. You'll learn where the harmful chemicals are used, what their health harm is, and what you can do as a consumer to reduce your exposure and reduce overall harm. So check out 6classes.org. The videos are 4 minutes, and there's an intro. So in 7 times 4, 28 minutes, you can learn a lot. If chemicals are in these families, sometimes they're important and necessary, so we don't say never use them, but say, is it necessary? Is it worth it? Is there a safer alternative? If you say to a mom, yeah, your children can eat lots of nice microwave popcorn and they're going to be eating PFAS, which is going to stay in their bodies for a long time and on the planet forever, she might think it's better to pop her popcorn that without the microwave bag. But if for some reason she really wants microwave popcorn, then the question is there a safer alternative for the microwave popcorn? And we do happily think that PFAS-treated microwave popcorn bags are on their way out, which is really a good thing. So today I'm going to be talking about our first class, PFAS, per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. And I have to say they are my favorite class, because they are potentially the most harmful. And the reason is because of the carbon-fluorine bond. It's the strongest bond in the periodic table, and it never breaks in the environment. So once you make a PFAS molecule, it's forever. They're called forever chemicals. On the other hand, they have useful functions. They give oil and water repellency, slipperiness, so they're both good and bad. And the PFAS that we've heard about a lot were what called C8s, 8 carbons surrounded by fluorine. So this is the structure, and at the end, if there's a carboxylic acid group, it's called PFOA. That's the molecule with the carboxylic acid, and if there's an S at the end, it's called PFAS, S for the sulfonic. And again, PFAS, PFAS, refers to the whole class, per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. So we're very interested in the whole class being phased out, not just the C8s, the PFOA and the PFAS, because the substitutes can be equally harmful. So the problem with these chemicals first came to the public attention when 3M, who is a big manufacturer of the C8, wanted to do some studies and went to a local blood bank to get blood for comparison that would not have any of these chemicals, and discovered that all the blood samples at the blood banks indeed did have PFOA. And they looked more widely and discovered PFOA was everywhere, and they decided to phase out the C8. However, they started making the C4, which I think I've just seen a paper saying that the C4, when people have high levels, it reduces their resistance to COVID. So C4 is not such a great chemical either. Now, I hope some of you have seen Dark Waters. It's a great film about Rob Bilott, who discovered massive PFOA contamination in West Virginia. He's played by Mark Ruffalo, his wife's Anne Hathaway. And after he discovered this contamination, there were lawsuits, a panel that found a health harm, and the money from the lawsuits was used to fund research on health effects. And from this research, we learned about health risks, which include two kinds of cancer: high cholesterol, obesity, immune suppression, etc. And of course, PFAS is in virtually all of us. So as I said, the C8, where you have 8 carbons, like PFOA, has been phased out due to its persistence, bioaccumulation, and toxicity. But the replacement is C6, very similar structure, equally persistent, less bioaccumulative in people, but more so in plants. It moves faster, harder to clean up. Water filtration systems that remove C8, the C6, which is smaller, can go right through in many cases. So this is what's called a regrettable substitute. And the industry then said, we phased out C8, we're at C6, it's all fine. They have all these glossy advertisements. If you're a chemist, you'll appreciate them saying that C6 is fine because it doesn't break down to C8. Well, yes. And so many manufacturers, though, chose to believe this. And so where we used to have C8, we now, unfortunately, have C6. And if you see something, it says PFOA free up there. PFOA is no longer made, so everything's PFOA free. But if it's PFOA free, it probably has C6 and should be avoided. We wrote a letter, several of, Maricel, who's another speaker on this panel, and I and 14 other scientists wrote a paper saying that due to the extreme persistence and potential toxicity, the whole class of PFAS is suspect. There's not enough time to study them all, and we should avoid the use of all of them. And I will say this paper now has about 27,000 downloads. This is a message that is resounding, and I was just speaking at a big PFAS meeting in the EU, and I was really pleased to see that in the EU, they are planning to phase out all unnecessary uses of the whole class of PFAS. So the thing that has gotten the attention of many communities is high levels in their drinking water. What's a high level? Over the years, a high level has been going down. In 2016, the US EPA said 70 parts per trillion was a high level, and about 10 million people's drinking water was contaminated at that level. And now it's thought various states are setting enforceable levels between 8 and 20. And with that, perhaps more than 100 million people's drinking water is contaminated. And people with contaminated drinking water really don't want more PFAS exposure from their food packaging. So if you want to know more about PFAS, if you decide it's as fascinating as I think it is. We have a website devoted to PFAS called PFAS Central. And every week we put down some of the most interesting news stories. We look through all the scientific papers and find the ones that seem most important and try to explain them in, just one or two sentences. We talk about policy change, jobs, events, everything PFAS. And one of the pages, the communities who've been drinking contaminated water, in some cases for decades, said to us, we want to buy products that don't contain any PFAS. We don't want it in our food packaging, but we don't want it in any of our products. So we started a list of PFAS-free products on that website that lists companies who have on their website that they do not have any PFAS in certain lines. So PFAS, once they're out in the world, are very difficult, problematic to clean up. The PFAS in food packaging, it's questionable how much ends up inside of us, but it all ends up in landfills and it all stays on the planet forever. So once PFAS is out there, it's extremely expensive and perhaps impossible to clean it up. And we think prevention is preferable. So I'd like to turn this back. Did I ever share my screen? Oh my goodness, what happened?
Yes, you've been sharing your screen, Arlene.
Oh, good. Somehow I'm trying to unshare and I don't see all that. Let me just escape. Sorry. Seem to be sort of stuck here. We did this really well when we practiced. So I'm hitting escape. It's not escaping. I don't know why. I'm sorry. Why do these things? Oh, no. Click. Okay, now it exited. Now I should be able to unshare my screen. Do I see Laurel's screen? Are you sharing now, Laurel? Or so are we okay?
I'm sharing. Yep, I think we're all set.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, thanks so much to Michelle and Jill and MBCC for hosting this event today. Thanks, Arlene, for getting us started. And thanks, Maricel, for being here as well. So I'll pick up the baton here and I'll be talking about food packaging as a source of PFAS exposure. What do we know and what are the concerns? So Silent Spring Institute has been working on PFAS for over 10 years now, and a lot of our work has focused on PFAS in drinking water. But we are also concerned about PFAS in consumer products and in food and food packaging as sources of exposure. And this is showing news coverage of some of our most important work on PFAS over the last several years. So how do we know that PFAS are in food packaging? Well, for one thing, we know that the US Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, has approved certain PFAS for use as additives to paper and board used as food packaging. And Maricel is going to talk a lot more about this. So PFAS are added because they confer grease, oil, and water resistance to paper products, and they're stable even at high temperatures. So PFAS have been added to food packaging since the 1950s, and they can either be added as a chemical barrier, so mixed in with the paper pulp while the paper is being manufactured, or they can also be applied as a surface treatment. If you want to know whether there's PFAS in your wrapper, you can't tell but by looking at it. PFAS aren't labeled on most products. You could try asking, but you might have a hard time getting an answer about it. Or you could also try testing. So PFAS are a broad family of chemicals. The latest estimate from the EPA is that there are over 9,000 PFAS compounds. And it can be difficult if we're looking for PFAS one at a time. We don't even know the chemical identities of all the PFAS that are added to products. So a popular approach to screening food packaging products is to measure fluorine. So fluorine typically is not present in paper at particularly high levels. And you saw from the chemical structures that Arlene presented, there were a lot of F's all around there, and F stands for fluorine. And so when paper has elevated levels of fluorine, that's a very strong indicator that PFAS has been intentionally added to that packaging. This is a graph from a paper that I'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. This is showing untreated paper, and this is with a method called PIGGY, or particle-induced gamma emission spectroscopy. And you can see these peaks here. This is showing fluorine, and this is a marker for PFAS being added to packaging. So what types of food packaging contain PFAS? Well, Arlene touched on this already, and I was glad to hear that microwave popcorn bags may soon not have PFAS as much, but typically past studies have shown that microwave popcorn bags very commonly do have PFAS, again, because they repel grease and do well under high temperature conditions, so they're added to microwave popcorn bags to prevent the greasy, buttery additives from seeping through the paper. This is a table from a 2017 report by the Center for Environmental Health, and they found that all of the microwave popcorn bags they tested were likely PFAS treated because they had high levels of fluorine. Another type of packaging that often contains PFAS is fast food packaging. So this is these are results from a paper that Silent Spring Institute led in 2017 that tested over 400 samples of food packaging from 27 fast food chains across the country. This work was a great collaboration with Arlene and the Green Science Policy Institute, Graham Peasley at Notre Dame, who ran that PIGGY total fluorine analysis, Environmental Working Group, the state of Washington, and a chemist at EPA, Mark Streiner. So we found that nearly half of the paper wrappers that we tested contained PFAS. These are wrappers for burgers and sandwiches, and also cookie and pastry pouches. About 1 in 5 of the paper board samples, so think of, say, boxes that hold sandwiches or French fries, about 1 in 5 of those had PFAS. And none of the paper cups that we tested had PFAS. This work got a great deal of attention when it came out in the national and international media. I think one of my proudest science career moments was that our study was covered by The Onion, the satirical online newsletter. But more seriously, this work has also informed policy. So just this past Saturday, the state of New York enacted a ban on PFAS in food packaging that will go into effect in a couple of years. And in the justification for that legislation, they specifically cited results for our paper. So it's been really gratifying to see that our science work has been translated so directly into policy. Another type of packaging that often contains PFAS is called molded fiber packaging. So that might not be a name that you are all that familiar with, but if you think of kind of brown, they're often labeled compostable or eco-friendly packaging, say at a salad bar or hot food bar. Those are called molded fiber packaging. And these often have PFAS added to help prevent grease from seeping through. In 2019, the news outlet The Counter, which then was called the New Food Economy, they tested compostable bowls from restaurants in New York City and found that all of them likely had PFAS based on their total fluorine content. This testing included Chipotle and Sweetgreen, and these two food chains, since this report came out, have announced that they will stop using food packaging that contains PFAS. Also last year, there was a report by the Toxic Free Future and Safer Chemicals Healthy Families. They tested packaging samples at grocery stores. And the good news was that only about 13% of the samples that they tested appeared to have PFAS. The ones that did have PFAS were mostly paper wrappers for sandwiches and baked goods, and some of these molded fiber clamshells and plates. So, okay, so PFAS are in the packaging. Is that a problem? Is that likely to contribute to exposure? And I'd say there hasn't been a ton of work on this, but from what we do know, PFAS can migrate out of packaging. Some early work by the FDA in 2008 showed that, that higher temperatures can increase PFAS migration, longer contact times between the packaging and food with emulsifiers. So these are chemicals that help stabilize foods that have both oil and water components. Previous studies have also found evidence of PFAS migrating into microwave popcorn, and microwave popcorn bags also contain volatile PFAS that may not necessarily end up directly in the popcorn, but may end up in the air and be a source of exposure through inhalation. Arlene touched on the difference between long chain and short chain PFAS chemicals. This paper came out in 2016 and it compared PFAS in food packaging in the US and in China. And the study, not surprisingly, found that in the US, the food packaging mostly contained short chain PFAS, and that's because long chain PFAS are no longer manufactured in the US and in the EU. By contrast, PFAS and other long chain PFAS are still manufactured in China. Arlene mentioned too that PFAS are more mobile, the short chain PFAS are more mobile in the environment, they're harder to remove from drinking water, and they also seem more likely to leach out of packaging. So this graph up here shows data from the same paper. This is the short chain for carbon chain PFAS, and this is 12 carbon chain. So we're going from short chain to long chain, and the study authors found that much more PFAS leached out of paper bowls when we were looking at the short chain PFAS. So, so what does this mean in terms of people's actual exposure? Is there evidence that this migration out of packaging actually leads to greater exposure in the general population? So last year, Silent Spring Institute published a paper. The lead author was Herb Sussman, and we analyzed data collected by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention as part of their national study called NHANES. And so we looked at data from 2003 to 2014 and evaluated associations between dietary patterns reported by the thousands of people that took part in the study and levels of PFAS in their blood. And we saw a very clear signal between consumption of microwave popcorn and higher levels of PFAS in people's blood. At the most extreme example, we found that daily consumption of microwave popcorn led to 63% higher levels of a long chain PFAS chemical called PFDA. And you might say, okay, well, there's not really that many people who eat microwave popcorn every day, and that's certainly true, but it does definitely show the potential for the PFAS in the packaging to be a source of exposure in the general population. We also evaluated where the food that people reported came from, and our findings were that eating more meals at home was linked with lower blood levels of 5 PFAS chemicals. And that might be attributable to a couple of factors. So one might be that food from fast food restaurants and other types of restaurants may have more contact with packaging, and so there might be more PFAS from the packaging. It's also possible that people eat different foods when they're out at restaurants than when they're at home. And so we weren't necessarily able to distinguish those two, but it does provide some evidence that, that packaging at fast food restaurants and other restaurants may increase exposure. And this is consistent with several other studies as well, one in Denmark and one in California, that also found that consumption of snacks, including popcorn, or specifically consumption of microwave popcorn, was associated with higher PFAS levels. Other studies, though, have not really addressed whether consumption of fast food or restaurant food is linked to higher PFAS. So it's more difficult to conclude whether the PFAS and other types of packaging are having a significant increase on people's, the kind of general population's exposure to PFAS. Whereas for microwave popcorn, we know, at least historically, that the packaging has very consistently been fluorinated. It's one specific type of food. So we see that strong association, and it suggests to us that the PFAS in other types of packaging also may be a source of exposure. And this is concerning because PFAS exposures have been linked to a wide range of harmful health effects. And this is based both on studies in people, so epidemiological studies. Some of these are based in communities that have had relatively high levels of exposure. For instance, the community in West Virginia that Arlene mentioned in the Dark Waters film. And others of these are conducted in laboratory animals, so toxicological studies. And often we see good agreement between both types of studies, which heightens our confidence in the results. So some of the health effects and biomarkers of health effects that have been linked to PFAS include elevated cholesterol, thyroid disease, certain types of cancer like kidney and testicular cancer, lower birth weight in infants, ulcerative colitis, preeclampsia, which is high blood pressure during pregnancy. There's very consistent evidence of effects on the immune system, including decreased vaccine response. So there are concerns right now that PFAS exposures may make highly exposed individuals more susceptible to infectious diseases like COVID-19 and may reduce the efficacy of the COVID-19 vaccine. Another effect that's been observed in laboratory animals is altered mammary gland development, and that's of particular concern for us at Silent Spring because we think that chemicals that can alter mammary gland development might increase breast cancer risk later in life. So I'll conclude with several take-home points. So PFAS are common in certain types of food packaging, such as molded fiber packaging, microwave popcorn bags, and fast food wrappers. PFAS can migrate out of food packaging, especially at higher temperatures and with certain types of foods, and depending on which type of chemical, especially short chain. And PFAS in food packaging can increase exposure in the general US population. And if you're interested in tracking how different states are addressing PFAS in food packaging, I would refer you to the Safer States website. So with that, I'd like to conclude and mention several resources, including the Silent Spring Institute website, the URI STEEP Superfund Research Program website, and the PFAS Exchange, which is a resource for PFAS-affected communities and a wide range of audiences. And that's been developed as part of our PFAS REACH study. So with that, I will pass the microphone over to Maricel.
Okay, let's see if I can share my screen. Can you see it?
Yes.
Excellent, thank you. Thank you very much, Mass Breast Cancer Coalition. And it is an honor to be here with Arlene and Laurel to share with you all some of the work I've been doing related to the FDA regulation of PFAS uses in contact with food. As I was introduced by Jill, I am an independent consultant, so this is my statement of disclosure of activities. And I have clients from the public interest organizations. I work with businesses. I also have been involved in asking the Food and Drug Administration to ban the use of certain PFAS, long-chain PFAS, in food packaging and other chemicals that are also packaging. And the work that I am presenting today is it was done with Environmental Defense Fund, but the opinions are my own. So this is just a repeat of Arlene's slide, but just to show you the PFAS. Just each of these red arrows here represent a carbon. So if every single carbon on the molecule is fluorinated, it's called per. So all the carbons fluorinated. If some of the carbons are not fluorinated, like this one here on the green, it's called poly. And then we have examples here of a short chain and a long chain. And both Arlene and Laurel explained those differences between the short chain and the long chain. So these are some of the examples of uses of PFAS. I remember before I got into this issue that I never stopped to think about why cardboard tray, when I put a frozen pizza in the oven and leave it there for half an hour at 400 degrees, didn't burn. But if something like that happens, same thing with the microwave bags, chemistry is involved, and in this case in particular is PFAS. So because PFAS are touching food, this is something that the FDA regulates. And the law that regulates food additives, chemicals added to food or that can become in contact with food and part of the food because they come out from the packaging, is from 1958. It's called the Food Additives Amendment. And what is important here is that the law established that any chemical before it's added to food or before it can be used in packaging that then becomes part of the food, it has to be safe. So basically, in short, a chemical is considered unsafe until it's shown to be safe. And what safe means, it means that it has to be a reasonable certainty that the intended use of the chemical is not harmful. But also it means that the additive cannot be a carcinogen, cannot be causing damage to the DNA. So carcinogens, chemicals with these properties, regardless of how much they could be in the food, they are not allowed, they are prohibited. So that is also part of the definition of safety. So the FDA has been approving PFAS uses in contact with food in 2 different ways. The blue box, and with this technical term called indirect food additives, those are decisions that FDA made. The agency approved these uses, and those uses are listed in regulations, and FDA owns that decision. On the green box is described the most common mechanism by which PFAS have been approved in the last, I would say, 15 years. So through something called food contact substance notifications. This is an analysis of the safety, of the safe use of the chemicals by the industry, by the manufacturer. FDA reviews that and gives an opinion on whether they agree with the manufacturer on the safe use, and that opinion is posted online. So there's an inventory that you can look at. So PFAS in general for use in contact with food are polymers. So these are long molecules, big molecules like Teflon, for instance. But these polymers are mixtures. So they have very large molecules, but also have in it unreacted ingredients. So to make a chemical, you have to start with individual substances, like when you're making a cake. You start with individual ingredients. And then the chemistry works its magic, and at the end you have a product, but that product is not pure. It comes with other friends that could be these unreacted starting substances or others that were formed during the manufacturing, etc. So this is a screenshot of that inventory that I mentioned, where FDA posts all the PFAS that had been authorized. So this is, as you can see here, if you search for the word fluoro, you get at least 70 records. So there is quite a bit of authorization for different uses. These are the most common authorized uses of PFAS in contact with food for grease-proofing fiber-based materials. So your cardboard boxes, pizza boxes, etc. It is actually now we are identifying quite common to be used as a processing aid in the manufacturing of plastic food contact materials, bottles and bowls, but also it's used to make components of food processing equipment. So the paper or cardboard, the plastics, all those are single uses, but the components of food processing equipment, so those are what is called repeat uses. They are part of a machine and they are not changed very often. So what do we know about the authorizations? This is all the public information that you can find in that inventory. You can know about the intended use. In this case, is for use as a grease and oil resistance to paper and paperboard. You find some of the limitations. Basically here, the manufacturer said it would not add more than 1% of the weight of the dry fiber. So 1% of that paper ball would be PFAS. Of the weight of the paper ball would be PFAS. This is another example. This is for the processing aid that is added to all polymers, basically all plastics. And again, in this case, they can add 2,000 parts per million or 0.2% of the final product weight is PFAS. So do we know that these things are safe? Well, we don't from the public information. So what we did with my colleague Tom Nelner from the Environmental Defense Fund, in 2017, we decided to submit several FOIA Freedom of Information Act requests to FDA. we focused on uses of PFAS in paper and cardboard. And I'm going to tell you a little bit now about what we learned. This is all technical, but basically for these uses were authorized to 6 companies, Daikin, Solenin, Solvay, Chemours, that is a spin-off of DuPont, Archroma, and Asahi. So only 6 companies have authorization for uses in paper and cardboard. So what did we learn? Well, we learned a little bit more about the chemistry and the structures of these molecules, because a name doesn't really tell you much about how the molecule looks like and how the polymers may be composed of. So these are just screenshots of different information that different manufacturers submitted to FDA. Because depending on how the molecule looks like, it could be more or less frequently removed from the polymer, the massive molecule. So another thing that we learned is that the functional polymer, what makes the paper grease-proof and waterproof, is just a small proportion of the mixture that is sold and is applied to the pulp, or is applied as a spray, as a coating in the final paper. So basically only 18% in this particular case of the polymer, of the mixture that you buy, companies buy in commerce, was the polymer, the large molecule that may not have any, have very low risk of causing health problems, but 82% are all these other impurities, the friends are explaining at the beginning, that comes with the polymer. So those residues can actually, based on this manufacturer disclosure to the agency, those residues are expected to stay on the paper at the end, on the coated paper. That was unclear before. But in this case, you have this here in green, this green arrow is highlighting a single PFAS. And the manufacturer said, yes, this will remain in the final paper. What about the rest? All the other impurities that come with the initial PFAS or are created during the development of the polymer. And they also said, yes, look at all these impurities here, and you can see the black boxes are the reduction from these materials. All these impurities that are PFAS and not are expected to migrate from the final paper into food. So this is an exemption. This is somebody at FDA forgot to redact this table. But this table here shows the list of all the impurities that this manufacturer included. And as you can see, everything that is in a green box here is the PFAS. So you even have PFOA, one of the most known villains of this class of chemicals, as an impurity in this particular list. We also know that FDA knew how much PFAS will be in the diet and what the individual exposure for a person that consumes food in contact with PFAS would be. So for this, in the 2 arrows here is showing the low molecular weight oligomers. So these are tiny chunks of the polymer that are of interest because they are small and they can be taken up by the intestine and then enter into the bloodstream. And the other arrow here is a single molecule PFAS. So in these cases, the manufacturer actually estimated that the dietary concentration, what would be in the diet of this particular PFAS, was 2.15 parts per billion. And they also estimated how much a person could eat per day based on these residues. So what was a little bit concerning is that FDA considered that these amounts are what they call, and this is a quote from a review by an FDA official, They call this vanishingly small, meaning it's nothing. However, just to put it into context, this particular number, the 2.15 parts per billion in the diet here, is approximately 2 orders of magnitude higher than the EPA Drinking Water Health Advisory for PFOA and PFOS, that is 70 parts per trillion. So 2 parts per billion is at least 2 orders of magnitude higher than 70 parts per trillion, just to put it into context. And if EPA is concerned about this 70 parts per trillion number, and as Arlene showed in one of her slides, there are states that have reduced this number quite substantially to even low double digits. So this is the other very interesting thing, that for something to be safe, you have to look at 2 things: the toxicity, the hazard of the chemical, and how much is the exposure. Well, because FDA consider that those exposures are very low, exposure is what is driving the safety determination. So very little information on toxicity is available. And the main focus is on genotoxicity, whether or not the PFAS, the monomers, the impurities could eventually cause cancer. And that is because of that's a second clause of the safety definition that I mentioned at the beginning. If a substance is known to cause cancer in man or animal, it must not be added to food. So all the toxicity that we have seen, or probably more than 90% of the cases, is just about whether or not the chemicals cause mutations, break the DNA, etc. Toxicity beyond genotoxicity is very rare. And definitely there hasn't been any studies, at least in the documents that we received, looking at whether or not these short chain chemicals are bioaccumulating in the body. Arlene mentioned that companies chose to believe that short chain PFAS were okay. Well, FDA chose to believe the same thing. We also observe other shortcomings in FDA's reasoning of the safety assessments. Again, assume that the C6s don't accumulate. They have not estimated the collective exposure of PFAS in the diet, and that is what they are supposed to be doing. So every exposure for every chemical is considered individually rather than the totality of exposure in the diet that is complex. And also FDA by law is supposed to consider PFAS as a class of chemicals, and they haven't done that. They are looking at these chemicals one at a time. So this is a very quick summary from the FDA regulations. Low exposures for the agency seems to be of no concern. The cumulative exposures are lacking, toxicity is lacking, information about how the body responds to these chemicals is also missing. Some of the rationale for assumptions they are made were unclear, and FDA continues to approve PFAS uses in contact with food. Now is when I tell you some good news. Something has been done so far to reduce exposure to some PFAS in food. These are specific actions that FDA took. The first one was in 2016, and this was in response to a petition that a number of public interest organizations submitted to the agency requesting that long chain PFAS, like the PFOA likes, should be banned because of safety concerns. And FDA agreed with our petition, and that was approved in January 4th, 2016. So this is, I believe, one, if not the first regulation ever from FDA based on safety concerns. The second one came later that year because it's sort of in response to our petition. 3M, the company that Arlene mentioned, submitted their own petition saying that the other long chain family, the PFAS, the sulfonates, they were not using those chemicals in food contact materials anymore. The use has been abandoned, and FDA agreed with 3M. And basically, these two things, the two 2016 decisions, basically revoke all the uses of long chain PFAS in contact with food from the regulations. And then in 2019, FDA committed to review the authorizations that have given since 2006. Mostly all of them are on short-chain PFAS. And part of the review that FDA has been doing, the scientists, I'm going crazy here. The scientists, FDA's own scientists, has uncovered that short-chain PFAS actually accumulate in the body, and they may have greater toxicity than has been reported. So there are also some voluntary actions from industry. The earliest one was in 2011, when FDA, prompted by actions EPA was taken against DuPont and other manufacturers of long-chain PFAS. FDA asked these three companies to submit more information about the safety of their products, and they said no. What we are going to do, we are not giving you information, we are going to suspend the interstate commerce of these substances. More recently, last August, Chemours also announced that had asked FDA to withdraw their approval of 3 of their PFAS. And now, a few months ago, FDA announced that 3 companies, Archroma, Asahi Glass, and Daikin, had announced a voluntary commitment to phase out their products. All of these are also short chain, affects 15 different authorizations. It's good news, but the phase out is expected to be completed by 2025, what I believe is a little too long. Last but not least, states have been very active. The first one leading the pack was Washington State in 2018, followed by Maine. I missed one here. This is Maine is 2019, and just recently this week, New York, or last week actually. Massachusetts has 2 bills to deal also with uses of PFAS in food packaging. And if you look at the map here, there are 100, almost 200 efforts at state levels to take care of PFAS and in different types of contamination, from food to drinking water to uses in firefighting foams. So with that, I thank you all, and I pass it on to Arlene.
Okay. Well, thank you, Maricel, and I'm going to be really brief because I think we really want to have time for questions. And I think some of what I'm going to say might repeat a little bit yours, but we will just talk again about what's happening now, going back to the Silent Spring study in 2017 that Lauren led, showing first the problem to the fast food packaging producers and the world. And shortly after that, actually in the US Senate, Senator Blumenthal wrote letters to all the companies alerting them about the problem. And we actually heard that the companies at that point began looking for good alternatives that had the function and didn't cost more. And so that's good news about, we believe that good science like that paper can lead to policy change, and it's coming slowly. To summarize, Washington State was the first to ban PFAS in food paper packaging, followed by Maine. The whole country of Denmark has banned it, and it's kind of an inspiring story. It started with the Danish co-op that would not sell anything with PFAS, so they stopped selling microwave popcorn, and there were big headlines because a big chunk of the people in Denmark shopped at the Danish co-op, and the headlines were "No microwave popcorn in Denmark, what will we do?" But what happened is 6 months later, a company from Wisconsin actually came up with alternative microwave popcorn bags that did not contain PFAS, which is what are sold in Denmark. And they're trying to make inroads into the American market. So that's one thing consumers can do, is demand microwave popcorn bags without PFAS. If they make them in Wisconsin and sell them in Denmark, we should have them. The city of San Francisco has an ordinance banning PFAS in all of restaurant food, takeout containers, restaurant use, and it has to all be compostable and have no PFAS. As Maricel said, New York State just a week ago, the California Department of Toxic Substances has listed all food contact materials containing any PFAS as priority products. And indeed, in the National Defense Authorization Act, which is the military budget of this year, they said military meals ready to eat cannot have any PFAS in the packaging. And we think things like military purchasing, big purchasing, once they shift away, then hopefully the shift will continue. Let's see. Sorry. So a lot of states have food packaging regulations being proposed. I'm listing them here quickly. And Massachusetts is one of them. And we can see that there are big changes where Taco Bell, Sweet Greens, this is repeating a bit what Maricel said, but there is really a big movement away from PFAS in food packaging. And indeed, a lot of restaurants and retailers are making statements, and some of these statements are commitments, others perhaps are ambitions, but there's been a huge shift since the 2017 paper. As I said, the really exciting things are in Europe, where the Nordic countries and Germany are proposing to phase out of all unessential uses of PFAS. And food packaging is definitely an unessential use. If it's, if only a part of it has it, we know that the other part can do without it. So all these products now are moving away from PFAS, and it's a good thing for the world. We don't have time to talk about them all now. I do suggest, as I said before, go to sixclasses.org, watch the 4-minute video on PFAS, and you'll get lots of ideas about what you can do to reduce your exposure. So I'll just end by saying that with reduced use of PFAS, we can have a healthier world. And a big thanks to all of you who are listening, and to the other speakers and the organizers. So thank you.
Well, thank you to all the speakers so far. We've got a lot of great questions that have come in. I'll just ask all the speakers to please have their microphones and videos on. There's a lot of great questions. One particularly timely question has to do with PFAS and the COVID vaccine. One of the attendees asked if someone could explain a little more as to why higher PFAS levels can lead to lower efficacy of the COVID vaccine. Is it because the exposure to PFAS reduces immune function, or something else?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Philippe Grandjean at Harvard. Oh, and it looks like, Jill asked the question. Anyway, he did research in children and found a relationship between higher levels of PFAS and lower immune response to vaccines. And he has continued that research. And I think he's part of the partnership that Laurel's in, so maybe she has something to add to that.
Yeah, I'll just add on, in addition to Philippe's work that's shown in children decreased vaccine response and similar studies in adults, there are also laboratory studies in animals that show suppressed production of antibodies as well. So the National Toxicology Program conducted a systematic review in 2016 and concluded that PFOA and PFAS were presumed immune hazards because of their ability to suppress antibody production.
And then on a related note, we have another question. Do you anticipate seeing a rise in PFAS in people's bodies given the rise in takeout during COVID?
I would think probably not, because the old long chains are they're very bioaccumulative and they stay a long time, and they tend to still be dominating, while the new is more of the short chains, which don't stay in our bodies as long. But I don't think we know. I don't know if Maricel or Laurel have other thoughts on that.
Yeah, I agree with Arlene. I don't think we know, but it would be very interesting to look at the data from 2020 onward. One of the problems is that the analytical methods to measure the short chain PFAS in blood or urine are not fully developed yet. So they cannot necessarily measure very tiny amounts. And the fact that we cannot measure doesn't mean that they're not there.
And a lot of them are polymeric, which means you don't get as much off during use, but we really should realize that they're on the planet forever, and they're in our landfills, and the landfill leachates end up in our water. So in terms of life cycle, for sure it's a big problem, and it's not as clear sometimes about human exposure with the polymerics. Polymer means a big molecule, so it's hard to get into you.
And I would just add that for the short chain, so one of the concerns about the long chain is they stay in our blood for a long time and they bind really strongly to proteins in our blood. And there's concerns that the short chain, while they don't accumulate in our blood to the same degree, might accumulate in other parts of our body. There's some evidence that PFBA, which is the very short version of PFOA, and the one that Dr. Grandjean's work suggests might affect COVID susceptibility, that one seems to accumulate preferentially in the lung. So even though they're not showing up in blood, they might still be in our bodies. But I guess on the flip side, based on what Arlene said, and manufacturers potentially, or retailers moving away from PFAS in food packaging, there's some hope that there's less reliance on PFAS containing packaging than there was when we did our study.
And just to say, I think consumer impact is really important at this stage, that manufacturers know they've got a problem, but they've been taking their time. You know, your paper was in 2017, and I heard they were going to move away, and I thought it would be gone in a year, but clearly they are moving slowly. I think there's a campaign against McDonald's now, who I think said they were going to get out of it several years ago. So I think consumer, asking when you buy things, that all can help speed the process. I think it will happen, but we want it to happen sooner rather than later, because they're with us forever. So the sooner the better.
So we have another question. Can any of the panelists speak to any regulations in Canada? Anyone familiar?
I know that they are looking at them as a class. So they're very interested in looking at not a single one, not one or two, but many, to see if they can take some action that could really make a difference quickly.
And then we have some questions regarding some other specific products: paper plates, pizza boxes, plastic bottles. And then is there anything in terms of eating in a restaurant, or is it really just the takeout packaging that we're concerned with?
Laurel?
I'll start, and then Arlene and Maricel, maybe you can chime in. So for pizza boxes, I guess I'd always assumed that PFAS were in pizza boxes because that's a greasy food, and that was kind of my understanding. As part of that Center for Environmental Health report, where they did find PFAS pretty consistently in microwave popcorn bags, they found most pizza boxes didn't contain PFAS. I don't know if Arlene and Maricel know more about that. As for paper plates, the testing by Toxic Free Future and Safer Chemicals Healthy Families found most of the paper plate samples they tested didn't have PFAS, although it was a kind of a smaller sampling. And I guess I forgot the third question, Jill.
About eating in a restaurant. Is that something that we should be concerned with, or is it more the takeout?
Right. So when we analyzed the CDC, the national CDC data in NHANES, the NHANES questionnaire asked specifically about whether people had eaten in a fast food restaurant or in a kind of sit down restaurant, and we did see that both kinds of restaurants, food from both kinds of restaurants, was associated with somewhat higher PFAS levels. So that could be attributable to packaging and potentially food that's served at restaurants being more packaged than food from home. But again, we weren't able to necessarily distinguish that between types of food that people eat when they eat out. We tried to control for fish and shellfish, which can be associated with PFAS exposures. But if people are eating more meat when they're out, or if they're eating other types of food when they're out, that could also be a contributor.
I think we have to keep in mind that there are also furniture and carpets and other consumer products in buildings that also contain PFAS. And they are contaminating, you can find them in dust, you can find it in other places. So some of the contamination that you see coming in restaurants, maybe it's just contamination from the environment, not necessarily from the packaging.
Then we have another question. Is PFAS in some masks?
I'm aware of that. I think antimicrobials are a problem in masks. They're not necessary or useful. Things like quaternary ammonium salts. You know, when they advertise an antimicrobial mask, there's no data that makes you safer. But the antimicrobials could be harmful, but I haven't heard about PFAS. Anyway, maybe
The water resistance that doesn't have PFAS, as far as you know.
That's a good idea.
I haven't seen any published studies on that. If it says stain resistant or water resistant, that would make me concerned potentially.
It is likely that some of the other type of personal protective equipment may be based on activities that doctors and first responders do. That they don't want to, you know, they want the repellency of water. But it is, I noticed some of those uses are considered essential because of the work that the functionality that does to the product and who uses those products. But I haven't heard about masks.
Okay, and we have a volunteer to help answer questions on specific packaging materials. One of our attendees, Gary Robinson from Synaptic Packaging, has offered his website, www.synapticpackaging.com. So thank you to Mr. Robinson. And then we have another couple questions about plastics in water bottles, plastic wrap, or other plastic containers like food, like fruit might come in.
So as far as I know, and Gary Robinson would probably know more about this, but PFAS is used as what's called a mold release agent, which is why you find it in artificial turf when it's releasing from the mold, and that could be also true of some plastics. Also, I think it might be used to make certain packaging go faster through the machines. So it might be a thin layer of polymer on the outside of things.
Yeah, we are also seeing it's used as a production aid. So it is mixed with the plastic polymer. So you have pellets of this processing aid that are PFAS based, and you have pellets of the plastic. They are mixed together to favor the passing of that mix through the dye, the mold, and then it's used to make films or bottles of water, not water, but bottles, plastic bottles, and other plastic components. And those can have up to 0.2% of the weight in PFAS. That is based on the new bunch of FOIA that we are getting from FDA.
And then we did have two questions about what happens to PFAS in incinerators.
So that's somewhat temperature dependent. So at very high temperatures, like over 1,000 degrees Celsius, the PFAS are expected to break down. There are concerns about incineration as a way to deal with PFAS if the temperatures are not maintained at that high temperature consistently, and all incinerators may not reach that high temperature. And there are concerns about whether there's any discharge into the surrounding communities living close to the incinerators. So in theory, it should work, but I think in practice, there are a lot of concerns.
A lot of environmental justice concerns because it's usually low-income communities, and like the military burned all their old C8 and not very well. So burning is not a good solution unless the technology is, Laura said, really carefully controlled.
And then there's a follow-up question about the PPE. Is there anything we can do to mitigate the exposure from PPE? Would cloth cotton masks, which are washable, be better than using paper filters? Anyone wants to try to answer that question?
Again, I don't have data on masks, but anything that you can reuse is good in my book than using it once and throw it away. That's all I have to say about masks.
Okay, well, we've run a bit over, so I think we'll need to wrap it up. I'm sorry if we didn't get to anyone's questions, but on behalf of Cheryl Osimo, NBCC's Executive Director, and the entire Board of Directors, I'd like to thank our panelists for sharing their expertise with us this afternoon. And I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you
Thanks,
all.
everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Yeah, great event. Thank you.
Yes.